This is the London Archaeological Archive. It's a real London treasure trove. Under one roof, it houses over 2 million objects, which tell us about our capital's history.
I'm interested in a very special part of this archive, and that's the archaeology that's been dug up from the Victorian East End. Each of these boxes contains objects thrown away by families from the Limehouse area. And these objects have been studied to give us a clear idea of how these East Enders really lived.
In a unique investigation, Queen Mary University of London and Museum of London Archaeology have joined forces to examine these objects and challenge the handed-down stereotypical views of the poor working class.
What we're trying to achieve through this investigation is trying to get some sense of a different view, a different perspective into looking at Victorian London. This way, by looking at the range of crockery they left behind, the glassware they left behind, the clay tobacco pipes they left behind, a range of all sorts of bric-a-brac, we're trying to achieve a kind of different view, a sort of more everyday view of what life was like for these particular people at this particular time.
London in the 1840s was Britain's fastest growing city, and with that came massive social inequality and the image of a city riddled with brothels, slums and destitution, and the idea that the working poor were little better than vicious criminals. One of the streets that would have been most feared by the middle classes as a place of notoriety and crime was Gil Street in the East End, literally painted black by social reformers. Families there were written off as drunken, lazy and immoral.
Where did the middle classes get this idea of the East End being nothing but a vicious den of iniquity? Because I can't imagine they visited here very often.
Well, not very often, but of course they did read about the East End, or they did read about poverty in London. For example, the novels of Charles Dickens were enormously powerful in shaping people's perceptions of poverty in the city. And then maybe later in the century, they consumed this idea of the threatening East End from the way in which the Jack the Ripper murders were reported in the press. So this is horrible London.
Gil Street still exists, but it's a far cry from that of Victorian London.
So if we peel back to the 19th century,
yes,
what would the street have looked like?
Well, this would have been a very typical working class street in the East End. So it would have been lined with two-storey terraces, a much narrower street at that time, so you would have opened your front door directly onto the street itself. And this would have been, you know, the heart of the East End community. Lots of people living together, often more than one family in a single dwelling.
And it was here, under the present site of Cyril Jackson's school playground, that the excavation on Gil Street took place.
And why did you particularly choose this location?
Well, it's here where we found the objects, and the fronts of the houses would have been roughly here where we're walking.
Okay.
But the objects themselves came from the privies that were at the back of the houses.
A Victorian loo?
Absolutely, yes. And there's a reason for that. In the late 1850s, this particular street was hooked up to the new sewerage system, which meant that the existing toilets, the existing privies, became redundant. We found some very interesting objects in these privies. People threw away crockery, they threw away broken ornaments, they threw away old toys, all those kinds of things. Things that give you a kind of real intimate insight into people's everyday lives.
The objects found at number 14 Gil Street were typical of what was dug up.
It looks like the bottom of a pestle and mortar, am I right?
Well, Tess, what you picked out there is in fact a glass rolling pin. It's a decorative object, and there's a story behind this which links into Limehouse's maritime past. The superstition behind them was that if they then fell off from the mantelpiece and broke, the sailor's ship had gone down, he'd been lost at sea, or that he'd fallen into the arms of another woman.
Don't know which is worse. But interesting that it was ornamental.
I think what this is either a frame from a mirror, or in fact it could be a picture frame. You can imagine that it would have had the image of a loved one within it.
First reaction is it's a sort of pair of pincers for getting toast out of the fire with or something. I've got no idea what that's for.
Well, again, this links into an object which is associated with Limehouse's maritime past. What you're actually looking at here is a fan handle, and it's made out of bamboo, so it would have been imported from China.
How surprising. Because, again, you would associate that with ladies of wealth in the West End.
I've handled all these incredibly personal objects, and they don't really strike me as the belongings of uncivilised, good-for-nothing rogues. I want to find out more about this family living at 14 Gil Street, so I'm heading to the local history library in Tower Hamlets, where historical archaeologist Dr. Karen Warner is going to help me find them on the 1841 census.
OK, so if I come down here...
As she guides me down Gil Street, I finally find number 14.
Oh, Anne Jones.
Yes, the double stroke.
Is that William?
It looks like it
We
is.
found our man, I think.
Yes.
Number 30, is that his age?
Correct.
And here we have his profession, trade or employment, which says,
Yes.
what does that say?
He was a brass founder.
What exactly is brass founding? Could that be connected with the shipping industry?
Oh, absolutely. Brass founders would have produced items for many uses, but in this neighborhood, absolutely, it's quite likely that he was producing brass fittings for ships. Brass founders would have poured molten metal into molds to produce 3D objects.
So we've got quite a skilled artisan there.
Absolutely.
And William is very fittingly and rather regally married to an Elizabeth.
It
Look
looks
at
that way, yes.
Yeah, great. And she's also 30. Aren't they well matched?
Yes.
And then these are her children.
You have a William Jr.
OK, and he's 9.
Yes.
And then a John
Yep.
Jr., aged 5. And an Elizabeth. Yeah. Elizabeth Jr., 3. A little 3.
In other records, Karen's found out even more about William Jones and his family.
I've done some digging and have found Elizabeth Jones in the local bank records. She's just down here, account number 1166.
Oh, yeah.
And so we see that she's begun with £15, 2 shillings, 2 pence. She's received her 10 shillings interest, and that brings her total for the year to £15, 12 shillings, 2 pence.
Now, given that we're talking mid-19th century, £15 sounds like a reasonably tidy sum.
In fact, in today's money, it's about £550.
And to have that amount of money set aside, was that normal? Was she kind of a standard East Ender?
Well, do you know something? In her neighbourhood, she was. Many of her neighbours appear in this ledger as well. And in terms of what they've got at any one time, Elizabeth falls smack in the middle of the zone of where her peers were banking. The holdings ranged from £7 to £19 at any one time.
But this is really kind of quite middle-class behaviour, or what you would assume to be quite a forward-thinking, educated behaviour.
Well, you know, so much about this project has been trying to get beyond these handed-down stereotypes of savage and desperate, impoverished East End working-class poor.
Karen showed me that William Jones was actually the treasurer of a society commanding a position of respect and trust in his community. With their middle-class aspirations, the Joneses later moved to a bigger house on a wider street with a garden for their growing family of 7 children.
The Joneses at number 14 have certainly shown me that they weren't the worthless criminals the middle classes were so scared of. In fact, they had jobs, they worked hard, they looked after their children. They were respectable members of their community. And what's more, they weren't alone. There were lots of other families like them living in the East End. And it's by piecing together all the available evidence that we're finally able to return the Joneses to their rightful place in history.